Hi everyone, and welcome to the webinar for the Fastest Law Kent Coastal Marathon and Half Marathon, where we'll provide mental tips to run a great race on the 6th of September. I'm Dr. Carla Meijen and I'm a sports psychologist at the University of Kent. So a cycling team, what is it? Well, it's originally founded in America in the 80s at the New York Marathon, where they decided to provide mental support provided by sports psychology professionals to runners who may not normally have access to it. So it's all done by volunteers. And we are the first to take this concept of a cycling team or provision of psychological support at long distance events such as a half and full marathon to the United Kingdom. So we've first done it in Tunbridge Wells for the half marathon earlier on in February, and now it's the first full marathon as well. So we're there to provide support pre-race, so you can think about the webinar that you're listening to at the moment, or you're participating in really at the moment, but also during the race, we're there to start to talk you through those pre-race jitters, during, and this is something there is an opportunity that's very unique, where race directors allow us to be there on the course, so you not just have the water points on the course, but you also have mental support available to you, so we can jog along with you and maybe talk you through those difficult points at the 11 or maybe 20-mile points. So we're there in very bright orange tops and you can flag us down if you need to. But we're also there post-race. So sometimes you might feel a little bit down after a race and you can talk to us to maybe help you make sense of that. But we'll come back to that later. There's also something called finish line ribbons. And again, I'll talk to you about that at the end of the presentation. But for now, remember to pick one up at the start of the race if you think that's something you might benefit from. And throughout this webinar, there's the opportunity to email your questions, tweet your questions, or post your questions on Facebook, on our Facebook page. And you may also be able to type in the questions at the bottom of this kind of screen that you see in front of you. And what we'll try to do is, after this 45 minute presentation, to address some of those questions at the end of the webinar, and hopefully you'll find this useful. So before I'm going to talk about all those different strategies that you can use and so on, it's really important to remember that every one of you approaches a race, approaches your training differently, and every runner is different. And therefore, the strategies that I'm going to talk about, they might work different for each of you. And I'd like to emphasize that you try to use those that you feel work for you. And also, before we start, what I'd like you to think about is two questions. First of all, maybe spend about 30 seconds or so just jotting down some answers. First of all, what mental struggles do you face when running a half or a full marathon? And secondly, what are some of the mental strategies that you're currently using? Maybe before a race, during a race, after a race, and so on. Just maybe write down 1 or 2 points for each of those questions. So I'll give you some examples what we typically find of mental struggles. It might be something that's related to your goal. This doesn't feel like I'm going to get my target time. Or you might have a really poor training session, your legs feel heavy, you had a bad day at work, and it's going through your mind like, how on earth am I supposed to do this? The race is next week, I don't feel unprepared. Or during the race, you might think, oh my gosh, I started way too fast. I can't believe my pacing is so off the mark. And I always do this. Why have I done this again? You get really upset with yourself. And all you can think about is that. You're not actually thinking about running anymore, but just beating yourself up. Something like, I'm feeling nervous, being very jittery, or my legs feel like jelly. Really, I just want to pack up and go home. What am I doing here? There might be a hill or two in the course. You're running up that hill, or you see the hill kind of coming up in front of you. You think, oh my gosh, that hill is enormous. Could be something like, my shoulders feel tight. Or, a runner who might just be coming back from an injury. I must improve my personal best. So really putting a lot of pressure on themselves to really do better, or maybe don't take into account that injury. So this is just a kind of a summary of maybe some of the mental struggles that you may recognize. And what's also really important to remember is that these responses are quite normal. And what we find in our research at the University of Kent is that these are typically aspects that runners do worry about. But the good thing is there are different strategies that you can use to deal with them. Okay, so how can we help you? Well, the goal of today's session is to really give you an introduction to some of the strategies that you might find helpful. And these strategies, they're aimed for a wide audience. And we're trying to make them helpful for a number of runners. So we do not necessarily address very individual issues. So it's slightly different than if you were to go see a sports psychologist on a one-to-one basis as a consultancy type sports psychology provision. It's more like a workshop where we try to tailor for a wider audience. But we do hope that you'll find at least some of the strategies helpful. What we also strongly recommend is to use the strategies that we're talking about, and particularly the ones that you're less familiar with. Try to use them in a training session first before using them in a race. Don't try to change up everything before the race. It takes time to learn how to use these strategies, but particularly it also takes time to remember to use them. And finally, you may already be using some of these techniques, which is really good. And our support therefore may be more useful to some runners than others, but hopefully you may be able to pick some things that are beneficial to you. There are different stages of a race, and you can use those mental strategies that we're going to talk about at different stages of the race. So you can think about pre-race, which are things like the weeks leading up to the race, the webinar, the moment, but also the morning of the race. So the moment you're leaving the house to go to the race and so on. Mental strategies that you're using may be slightly different during the race. So at the start point, you kind of, feel that urge to go to the toilet all the time. You really kind of feel those butterflies and you start to worry about the course, or do you remember where you want to kind of, what your pacing will be like, what's your goal, and so on. But also during the midpoint and the last few miles, so kind of breaking up the race in different stages. But also post-race, to kind of reflect on your performance and try to take the positives out of it and take that on with you to the next race. So what we'll do next is to go through the different stages of the race in a little bit more detail and kind of trying to identify the types of things that might occur pre-race, during the race and post-race before we're moving on to the strategies, where we then touch on how you can implement those strategies at the different stages of preparation, during race and post-race. And when we're thinking about pre-race, probably, pre-race, the last thing you want to have is a negative mindset. And maybe have a think about what the types of things are that you can do before a race. What can you typically do in your preparation? And also, what are maybe some of the mental struggles you face before the race? So this could be the morning of the race. You might worry about, have I packed everything I need? What about the traffic? I don't know if I can do this, and so on. So these are examples of maybe mental struggles that can interfere with you approaching the race in a more positive manner. So again, what I'd like you to do at this stage is to maybe spend a little while thinking about what you typically do to prepare mentally for a race. This is quite important to maybe think about in two different ways. How do you prepare mentally in the weeks leading up to the race? But also, how do you prepare mentally during the morning of the race? So maybe again write down one or two things of the things you do to mentally prepare in the weeks leading up to the race, and of those things that you might do the morning of the race. If you're not too sure at this stage, that's fine. Maybe when we talk about the different mental strategies later on, you may come up with some things that you think, oh, well, actually, yeah, I do that. Or, yeah, oh, this is actually something I can start doing in the weeks leading up to the race or during the morning of the race. So moving on from pre-race to during the race, what are maybe some of the thoughts you have during the race, and how may these thoughts be different to what you may be thinking before the race? It may be related to your pacing, how fast or how slow you're going, or it might be, oh, I really want to catch up that person, I want to overtake them. It might be that you had an injury and you start feeling your knee getting a little bit achy and sore and so on. So there are different types of things that may go through your mind, and what we'll do next is to talk to you about the strategies that you may want to use to prepare for those mental struggles that you may face. And good training runs are quite useful in helping you to identify some of the thoughts you may have during the longer runs, and you may recognize some of those during the actual race. But what we're doing with the cycling team, we're also trying to explain or help you post-race, because this is quite important in helping you to reflect on the positives of the race and to take those with you into your next training runs and your next races. And therefore, try to think about how you feel after the race. Things like, did I reach my goal? Was this something I'm happy with? And so on. And you may also have heard about the post-marathon blues, and this is quite a nice example from Runner's World, where someone named Michael said about when finishing the New York City Marathon, talked about having runner's high for about 24 hours, and now they felt depressed. They hit the wall early in the marathon and didn't come close to the time they wanted. So they kind of talked about the goals and maybe not achieving the goals. I feel like I lack goals, and I'm embarrassed when friends ask me what my time was, though most wouldn't know the difference between a 2-hour or a 6-hour marathon. Any suggestions, experiences, or thoughts would be appreciated. Thanks. So Michael sent a question to someone from Runner's World to help deal with those marathon blues. So again, this is something that we'll try to touch on during the webinar today. So in a nutshell, what are the strategies that we're going to talk about? So the strategies that we're going to cover today are goal setting, preparation and routines, relaxation strategies, self-talk strategies, and imagery and visualization. So we don't have a lot of time to go into those strategies in detail, but hopefully there will be enough in there for you to have an understanding of what you can do, and hopefully an understanding of how you can use those at different stages, so the pre-race, during race and post-race. The first strategy we're going to talk about is goal setting. And goal setting is really important. It's a really important part of your preparation, but also on race day. It might give you that motivation during those long training runs, but also to keep going during the race. On the other hand, sometimes goals can cause a lot of pressure, particularly if the goal's too challenging, very difficult to achieve, or it may be that you're coming back from an injury and still trying to work towards a goal that you've set before the injury. And a lot of times we tend to talk about goals in terms of time-based goals, such as a 3.5-hour marathon or a sub 2-hour half marathon, but there's a lot more to goals than just the times. So to give you an example, you can set a goal that's related to how you're going to pace your race, maybe how you're going to deal with pain, and so on. And another example could be on how you're going to deal with your emotional responses during a marathon or a half marathon. It's pretty much an emotional roller coaster for some people when they're running such a long distance event. And therefore a goal could be to use positive self-talk when you start getting angry or upset with yourself because you've started too fast. And we're getting to self-talk and how to use positive self-talk later on. But a goal such as that can be used as well in addition to time-based goals. Okay, so now we're moving on to some goal setting advice. And before we do this, perhaps you'd like to write down your current goal and see how some of this goal setting advice may be useful for you. So the first piece of advice is to break up the race in different parts. So you can consider breaking up the race into an early stage, a middle stage and a late stage, and setting different goals for these different stages of the race. So the early stage, a goal may be to enjoy the race, to look at the things around you, and the middle stage to really keep going, and the late stage maybe to deal with the kind of pain management or hitting the wall and so on. And the idea is to set goals for the different parts of the race, and it can be different types of goals. So for some of them, that could be time-based goals, or it could be pain management strategies type goals. But it's also important to set specific and realistic goals. And you can consider to base these goals on your training progress, but also to take into account your recent circumstances. So, for example, you may have had a really busy week at work, or you may have had the flu recently, and therefore your training may not have been going as well as you've planned, or you may have had an amazing training run recently, and your training has been going really, really well and better than it did. And in those instances, you can change your goal as well. And that's really important because that will then give you that motivation to keep going and pushing yourself during the race. But also during the race, what you might want to do is to set more than one goal. And one of those could be your dream time. So in an ideal world, what would be the time you'd be able to achieve? So if the weather's perfect, what would you be able to achieve? But also consider what's a realistic time. And finally, what would be an acceptable time that you'd be okay with? And for some people, this may be finishing the race without walking and so on. So this is something that consistently, when we're running a cycling team and providing advice in terms of goal setting, runners have found is really useful. And our final piece of advice relates to self-assessment goals. So you could think about pain management strategies, for example. It's quite unlikely that during a long distance running event, such as a half or a full marathon, that you won't feel any levels of discomfort. It's quite likely that you feel some niggles here and there during a race, and therefore you may want to prepare yourself mentally for that and how you're going to deal with that. So at those times when maybe when you're entering the late stage and you feel quite a high level of discomfort, how are you going to keep yourself going? What would be a pain management strategy? And for some people, it might be counting the number of red cars, or when you're running the Kent Coastal Marathon, it may be counting the amount of seagulls that are, passing, and so on. And finally, it's also quite important to not set too many goals, as this can easily put more pressure on you. And finally, in terms of goal setting, what's really important is to make sure that the goal is something that's within your control. And yes, finishing higher than your club teammate might give you that motivation, but they may have been able to do a lot more training than you this year. So it's really difficult to use a goal like that that's not within your control, and it can get really frustrating as well. And this point's really important. It's making sure that that goal is something you really feel passionate about. So it's something that you have set and that you want to achieve. If this is the case, then what research demonstrated is you're more likely to actually achieve that goal and to keep pushing yourself. And also, don't be afraid to adjust your goal if you need to. Trying to work towards a goal that's too challenging can be very frustrating, and it might put you off racing in the future. And finally, research has shown that you're more likely to remember your goals if you write them down. And you can take this with you. So for example, if you put it on a small piece of paper, you can write it on your hand or a wristband. That may help you to carry, remember them when you carry them with you and to keep going. And from goal setting, we're moving on to preparation routines. And when we think about preparation and routines, what a race does, it often brings different demands than our training runs. And it's not uncommon that at the last minute, runners change their preparation and their routines. And when you're thinking about maybe your own experiences, have you ever changed your food intake just before a race? Or perhaps you went to bed very early before a race and you struggled falling asleep? And this might all sound really straightforward, but you'd be surprised how often this comes up. And in our research, we found that the preparations and the worries about getting there on time are negatively affecting the pre-race preparation. And it's sometimes the unexpected that makes us worried about a race. Things like, where are the water points? And how far are the toilets? What will the course be like? Or what if I get stuck in traffic on the way there? So, moving on to some advice in terms of preparation. One of the pieces of advice that we'd like to give is to be curious about what's around the corner. And yes, there might be a little hill here or there, but also be curious about what you do not know. If you're starting to worry about parts of the course that you're unfamiliar with, this may cause a lot of undue pressure. And being apprehensive may take up a lot of energy. But there's things that you can do in terms of preparation. Things like knowing the race course and plan your strategy accordingly. And the race course can usually be found on the website. So perhaps your normal pacing strategy may not work for a particular race. But also to consider your water strategy. How are you going to do this, and can you practice this in training runs? We've spoken to runners who have different water strategies that they tried out in races, and they were thrown and were not feeling very comfortable throughout the race. But also for the weather. Look at the weather forecast and prepare yourself for different conditions. And control what you can. So we already touched on knowing the race course, considering your water strategy, preparing for the weather, and try to be organized what you know. This can reduce a lot of pressure. And routines are also important because they can be part of your preparation and they can help you to deal with some of the pressure, and they can be useful to normalize, as we call that, a race and make it as similar to a training session. And it's not just about the physical routines, but it's also about the mental routines. So when we're thinking about a physical routine, this can relate to warm-up. So try to have a warm-up that you can do in various conditions. So you want to have a warm-up that's within your control. So it doesn't matter where the race is, you can still do that particular warm-up. But also think about your mental routine. You can consider doing breathing exercises if you feel nervous, or you can use visualization on how you will tackle the course. And we're getting to relaxation and visualization after this. Routines can also help you to feel that you're more in control of the situation. And this is something that is very powerful. On the other hand, sometimes in terms of a warm-up, it may not be possible to do the exact warm-up that you normally do. And therefore in your routine, try to build in some flexibility, as sometimes you will need to adjust parts of your routine. So moving on to relaxation and breathing strategies. Have you ever felt that your shoulders tighten up at the start line or during the race? Or you're sometimes clenching your fist when you're running? These can all be signs that you're tensing up. When you're in pain or discomfort during a race, this is not uncommon. A lot of runners suffer from that. And this is where relaxation and breathing strategies are really useful. They can help you to deal with these tense feelings. And tense muscles are quite likely to slow you down. And before a race, what you can do, you can help yourself to relax by going through a breathing routine. And you may already be doing this. It will help you to just focus on your breathing, and the great thing about that is if you just think about your breathing, you're not necessarily thinking about all the other things. So your worries about your goals, your pacing, discomfort, whether you can do this or not, and so on. And when we're thinking about a breathing routine, there are a lot of apps out there that can guide you through this. One app that I particularly like to use is an app called Breathe to Relax, and I'm not getting any money for this, but it's available on Android and Apple. And when you're thinking about breathing strategies and relaxation strategies, they can also help you to sleep well. So it's very useful to do this the night before, and it will also help you to recover muscles more quickly because of the increased blood flow that relaxation and breathing strategies will provide. So when we're thinking about relaxation strategies, they can help you with that muscle recovery and your sleep. And one commonly used active relaxation strategy is called progressive muscular relaxation. And the idea of that is that you're tensing a muscle group for 5 to 7 seconds and then relax that muscle group for 20 to 30 seconds. So you're really trying to feel the difference between tension and relaxation. So a well-known example of how this would feel, for example, in your fist is the following. So make a tight fist with your left hand and feel the tension in your knuckles, your hand, your lower arm. And let all the tension go, just in one go, and feel the difference between the tension and the relaxation. And that contraction phase really can help you to become aware of how the absence of tension can feel. And there are plenty of YouTube recordings out there that can talk you through a progressive muscular relaxation routine. We won't go through this today because I want to spend a little bit more time on self-talk strategies, but hopefully you can find some on YouTube, and if you need advice on which one you may want to use, you can always get in touch with us. Throughout the webinar, we've probably touched on the notion of self-talk a number of times. And self-talk refers to those things we say out loud or in our head. And you might recognize that idea of an internal dialogue in your mind when you're running. Things like, I want to pack up and just go home, my knee is killing me, why am I doing this? Or why did I ever sign up? How long is there to go? Oh, this race has been a disaster. I'm not even halfway yet. There's still a long way to go. I don't know if I'll ever do this again. So they're just some examples of those things we may say out loud or in our head. I'm mostly given negative examples there, or unhelpful examples, but there's also helpful examples such as I'm feeling strong and I'm really enjoying this and so on. But this internal dialogue that's going on in our mind, sometimes we remember it, but a lot of times we're not necessarily aware of it. And this awareness is something that we require if we want to change it. So when we're thinking about self-talk, what's really important is to understand the difference between helpful and maybe unhelpful self-talk. So when we're thinking about helpful self-talk, what that is, it really varies for different runners. But to sum it up, it's something that will give you energy and it does not make you feel more worried. It's something like being a good coach to yourself. So what would a good coach tell you? And you can use this helpful self-talk to motivate yourself. Things like, I can do this, just keep running, or I've trained hard for this, I can definitely do this. Or perhaps you might think running a half marathon or a full marathon is supposed to hurt. And if it doesn't, that means I can run faster. Or you might have that dialogue in your mind that you're saying, if you're running a race, you're likely to push yourself a bit more, particularly compared to training. And of course this is going to hurt. Let's just be prepared for this. Smile. So sometimes it could even be a very short buzzword such as smile or keep it up and so on. In addition to kind of that type of motivational self-talk, you can also use helpful self-talk to focus on your running style and your race plan. So more in terms of, for example, strategy or a technique. So when you're thinking about tense shoulders, kind of going back to relaxation, for example, it could be that you're using helpful self-talk to tell yourself to relax those shoulders, or to focus on your breathing, or focus on resting in general and having a smooth stride. Could be things like driving forward, but it could also relate to your race plan, so that you're telling yourself to stick with your race plan and maybe relate it back to goal setting, break up the race in different stages. Or it could relate to your rhythm or maintaining a particular pace, such as maintain this pace, as simple as that. Or keep your eyes focused straight ahead. These are all things that can be quite useful in terms of focusing on your running style and your race plan. But sometimes what you prefer to do is to take your mind off running. So this is something that in the literature they also call dissociative strategies. And sometimes it could be counting the seagulls that you might encounter on your race, the Kent Coastal Marathon and Half Marathon. And sometimes it could be a particular song that you sing while you're running. And I've also spoken to runners that are redesigning a room in their house when they're running the marathon or half marathon, and that will take their mind off the pain or off negative thoughts or unhelpful thoughts. And quite recently, Harriet Thompson at the San Diego Marathon, which she finished as the oldest person to complete a marathon, was telling the media that she replayed piano recitals in her head. She used to be a very successful pianist, and she was talking how she would go through all of these things to keep her mind off the pain and so on. So these are also things that you can do to help your to use self-talk to take your mind off running. So we've spoken about motivational self-talk as a way of helping you. We got something we call more instructional self-talk to focus on your running style and your race plan, but also this idea of taking your mind off things, so distracting or dissociative self-talk. And we'll cover 2 strategies that you can try during the next 2 weeks to make it a little bit more practical. And I've understood that particularly self-talk strategies are something that runners are interested in. So the first strategy that we're going to talk about is thought stopping. And the second strategy we're going to talk about is changing unhelpful self-talk for more helpful self-talk. So we've already talked about some helpful self-talk examples that you can use, but kind of trying to identify unhelpful self-talk will help you to then replace it with more helpful self-talk. So moving on to the first of those 2 strategies, thought stopping. This is a strategy that you can try to use when your self-talk, and particularly if it's unhelpful self-talk, is very frequent. It's distracting, or when it may lead to self-doubt. And the first step to this is try to establish how often you use the thought. So, for example, you might say, I just want to pack up and go home. So the first thing you want to do then is to use a trigger to stop this thought, and one of the things that you might want to use is an elastic wristband. I would warn a bit of caution here. Try to use one that doesn't hurt too much if this is a very frequent thought, because your wrist might get very red. And it makes you become more aware of the thought, and every time you might tap that wristband, you think, okay, I've just thought that thought and let's stop it, or hopefully you may be able to change it, which we'll come back to later. So you want to use maybe or identify a positive statement to replace that negative thought, or a statement, a dissociative statement, that takes your mind off the unhelpful thought. So here are 2 examples. The first one is, okay, well, relax. Let's first get to the 11-mile point now, and I'll take it from there. Or some runners I've spoken to at the cycling team events in the past, they were referring to something they were looking forward to for after the race, such as, there will be a pint waiting for me at the finish line. What we would recommend though is to use this in training first before competition, because thought stopping can be quite an energy consuming exercise, and particularly if it's very often. Alright, so moving on to changing unhelpful self-talk to more helpful self-talk. So the first step there is to link a negative thought to a positive thought, and that can help you to bring you back to the here and now. And what we mean with the here and now is just to focus on the act of running. And when you're making a list of unhelpful and helpful thoughts or statements, you can ask yourself the following 2 questions to help you become more aware of the self-talk. The first question is, when do you make this statement? And the second question is, what caused you to make this statement? And when we're thinking about statements, these can also be buzzwords. It doesn't have to be a full sentence. This is something you can do in the next 2 weeks. After a long training run, you can list the self-talk that you've used. You can try to circle those statements that you found helpful, and perhaps write down why you think they were helpful. And you can underline those ones that you did not find helpful. And you can again write down why you did not find them helpful. The next step is to find another self-talk statement that may be more helpful to replace that unhelpful statement, and you might want to use this one in the next training session. And what you can do at the moment, you can tweet, Facebook, or email us and share some of those helpful thoughts that we can share with others. The final strategy that we're going to talk about is the use of imagery, which is about the use of all your senses. The most commonly known one is vision in the context of imagery, but also touch, smell, the sounds you hear, and so on, to recreate or create an experience in your mind. So an example is to use imagery to recreate a time when you had a really good long training run to help you deal with an image of having jelly legs, or to give you confidence to keep going. For the use of imagery, I don't want to spend as much time on this as the use of self-talk. However, I want to give you a little bit of an idea of how you may be able to use it. So when we're thinking about using imagery, one of the things that are very important is to make the image as vivid as possible. And you might want to write down as many details as you can remember. And this could be the color of your running kit, it could be the weather, it could be how you felt when you were running, it could be your emotional state, and so on. And it's really important to start with a basic image, such a particular part of a short training run, and try to see if you can control this image. And if you can control this image, see if you can try to change it. An example of this, try to imagine yourself running against the wind and you're feeling strong. And try to use the feeling of touch of the wind, how it feels, but also the sound, the smell, and so on. And try to keep the image positive but realistic, just like your goals. So these were all the strategies that we want to cover for the webinar today. So we've covered goal setting, we've covered relaxation, we covered routines, we also covered the use of self-talk and the use of imagery. Now to something that's very unique to the cycling team events, and that's something called finish line ribbons. And we'll be handing these out at the start of the Kent Coastal Marathon and Half Marathon. And there are basically two rules to these pieces of finish line ribbon. Because they're part of the finish line, the idea behind these pieces of finish line ribbon is to take them across the finish line. And the second idea of the finish line ribbons is to attach a buzzword, a thought, or reason for running to the bit of finish line ribbon that you can associate with it. And you may also want to think about some of the strategies we've just spoken about. At previous events, when we spoke to runners, sometimes it was a song that really energized them. So whenever they felt discomfort, or they may felt they may be hitting the wall, they were looking at the finish line ribbon, which you can on your bib, so it's not in the way, but you can look at it, so it's quite a bright color, and that might help you to remind yourself of the reasons why you're running. So those two rules, bring across the finish line and thinking about your reasons for running, or a buzzword, and so on. So pick one up, or you might want to make one yourself if you find that is something that would help you. So moving on to some final tips. The first one is to run your own race. It's very tempting when it's a race to go with someone else's pace, or to start off too fast. And try to go at your own pace, as starting too fast or following someone else's pace can catch up with you later on. But also to expect the unexpected, and things might go wrong. You don't always get to run the perfect race. Expect that things may go wrong, and more importantly, consider a way that you can forgive yourself for this. For example, you may start too quick. What can you do to not beat yourself up about this? But also, reward yourself. You may be disappointed if you did not run the perfect race, or you may not have a very good training session, but do try to reflect on the positives of the race and try to take this with you to the next race or next training session. And also, try out the strategies in training before implementing them in a race. Dramatic changes just before the race may actually do more damage than good. It's not going to be a change that happens overnight, and it requires practice. And finally, and this is something that I find quite important, is try to have some fun. And if you manage to smile, that might help you to dissociate from some of the discomfort at some stages of the race. And smiling may also help you to relax a little. So if you're interested in some further resources, there's the website where there's information about the different psychological support teams over the world, but also some information about a systematic review that we've recently published, which is widely accessible. So you don't need any login details, you can just click on that link there. But also, an academic publisher has provided free access to a collection of research about running, which is free to look and download until the end of 2015. And there's a really interesting video on YouTube where they're talking about the different stages of a marathon and the half marathon, and particularly kind of the emotional responses that people may perceive or may experience. And as you're probably aware, the Runner's World magazine also has a wide range of articles. So just to sum up the webinar, thank you for listening so far. Try to remember, if you would like to have a finish line ribbon at the start of the race, we will be there, so you can find us in our bright orange shirts, or you want to make one yourself. If you manage to practice some of the strategies on your longer training runs, you might want to think about which buzzwords work for you. And if you have some unhelpful thoughts during the race or you feel discomfort, the finish line ribbons can help you to remember the strategies. There may be a song that helped you during training, or you might be running for a specific reason. And during the run, we will be on different points of the course. So for example, the 11-mile point for the half marathon and full marathon, but also at the 22-mile point, 23-mile point. And you can recognize us in our bright orange top. So if you want us to jog along with you, we won't be probably fast enough to run with the speedy runners, but if you want us to jog along with you, or you just want to chat about how it's going, flag us down and we'll be there for you. So thank you very much for listening to today's webinar about the use of psychological strategies when running a marathon or half marathon, and we hope you enjoyed it. What we're moving on to now, if you are watching this time, is the most commonly asked questions. So throughout the webinar, you've been able to ask questions on Twitter, Facebook, and via email. And we'll get to those now. For those who are not watching this in real time, thank you and goodbye.